Welcome to Tech Primers. In this video, we are going to see how to deploy a Java application onto Docker. So basically what we are going to do is we are going to create a simple Spring Boot application and we are going to create a jar out of it and we are going to deploy that jar into a Docker container and we are going to see how to do that. So what I have done is I have downloaded Docker. So since I have a MacBook Pro, so I have downloaded the Docker engine for the Mac and I have installed it already. So if you have a Windows machine, you can try that as well. So you can go ahead and download that from the official Docker website. It is open source basically, so you can download that and you can install it. So once you do an installation, would have to start the Docker engine. So what I basically did is I have the Docker here. So I just started the Docker engine here. Okay. So once I started, so this is what is showing up. So it is showing that Docker is running and these are just the different information about Docker. You can just stop the Docker or Docker engine, or you can restart the Docker engine. You can go to the Docker store and stuff like that, and you can update the Docker engine software as well from here. Okay, so right now the Docker engine is running in my machine basically. So if you go back to my previous video of how Docker is, imagine that okay, the Docker engine is now running over my OS. Okay, so now if I create a container, it will just create an image for me. So it will basically create a container over my OS and then that space will be allocated with internally all the root permissions and everything for me to do something. Okay, so what we are going to do is we are going to create the Spring Boot application. So uh, as usual, we'll go to the Spring Initializer website. So start.spring.io. So what I will do is I'll just create a basic Spring Boot application with just a small REST endpoint, and we'll be able to deploy that into Docker and see how a Spring Boot application is getting deployed. Okay, so it is the same procedure for doing any Java application as well, but we are going to use Spring Boot. So it's the same thing, right? So Spring Boot is also a Java application basically. So I'm just going to do that. So I'm just going to say comtech primers docker. So we are going to say docker spring boot. So I'm just going to name it as docker spring boot. I'll just use the spring MVC. Okay, so I'm just going to create the project. I'm just hitting the generate option. So this should generate the project for us. So let me download it here. Okay, so it got downloaded. Let me unzip it. So it has got unzipped. So let's go to IntelliJ. I'll open that project now. So what was it? Docker spring boot. Yeah, so this is the project, right? So let it open. I'm maximizing this window. Okay, so yeah, our basic spring boot application is ready. So let's quickly go ahead and create a small package called resource. I'll just add one REST endpoint. I'll just for simplicity I'll just add a small REST endpoint to show us just a message. Okay, so I'm just going to say hello resource. Okay, so this is going to just say hello YouTube. Okay, so we need the REST controller, so I'm adding the REST controller. So I'm using spring MVC, as you know. So I'm going to say REST slash docker slash hello. Okay, I'm just going to create some REST endpoint. I'm saying get mapping public string. Okay, I'm just going to say return hello YouTube. Okay, so I've just created a basic spring boot application with just one REST endpoint, which is going to say hello YouTube. Okay, so I'm going to build this particular project. Okay, before that yeah, I think I can build this. So let this get built. So meanwhile I'll open a terminal. So as you notice, right, the docker engine is already running. Okay, now what we are going to do is we are going to use the terminal, okay, to see what we can do with docker. Okay, so before that we need to create something called Dockerfile. Okay, so we need to create a Dockerfile for Docker to use the configuration. Okay, so I have created a Docker file. So the naming convention for a Docker file is you have to name it as Docker file with decaps. Okay, inside the Docker file we need to tell Docker what type of application it is. Okay, so whatever application which we are going to deploy, we need to tell what type of application it is. So we need to use from. So this basically downloads the image from the Docker Hub. So if you notice, Docker Hub is a website which Docker has. So it is something similar to the Maven repository or something like that for the Docker. So the URL is hub.docker.com. Okay, yeah. So if you notice here, this is the Docker website. So here you have lots of repositories which are there. So let's say if I search Java, so I'll be having lots of images basically. So these are nothing but repository of images which with which you can run your application. So basically Docker runs on images, right? So you can use any image to use it along with that with your application. So here if you see, Java is there. If you notice, Java is deprecated right now because they have created something called OpenJDK. Okay, if you notice here, it is mentioned as deprecated. So there is something called OpenJDK. So I'm going to use that. So if I say OpenJDK, so and whatever is mentioned with official, that is what has been published by Docker. And if there are something, so for example, if you see here, this is Oracle specific. So and same way, this is designed by some other developer, so you can use them, but it is better to always go with the official versions, right? So those are having premium support, and those will be reliable basically. Okay, if you see here, this is the documentation, and they have some guide on how to create the Docker file or how to deploy the Docker engine. Okay, so what we have done is we have created the Docker file, and I'm going to say that from I'm going to give that Docker image. I'm going to say OpenJDK, and we have to mention colon, and we have to mention what is the version. So if you notice here, these are different version numbers. Okay, you can give 6b 38 JDK. So this is the Java 6 version of update 38. So same way for every version we have a number, but I'm not going to use any number, any specific number. I'll just mention 8. If I just mention 8, it is going to use the 8 update 131. Okay, so that is why I just mentioned 8. So I'm not worried about the version right now. The next thing is I need to add the jar, right? So I need to add the jar which is built by our application into the Docker container. Okay, so basically I need to copy the jar which we generated into the Docker container so that it can run. So let's see what is the jar name, right? So if you notice here, this is the jar name. So actually the jar name is so huge, so what I can do is I can rename that when I build it here itself. So in my build, right, I can give the final name. I'll just name it as Docker Spring Boot for now. Okay, and then I'll rerun so that it can rebuild and create a jar. Meanwhile, what we will do, we'll go to the Docker file. So as I said earlier, so we have to add the jar into the Docker container. So what we need to do is we need to say add, and we need to give the path of the Docker file, basically the Docker jar. So what we did is we created a Spring Boot Docker Spring Boot dot jar, and we need to add this particular jar into the container. Okay, so we can give any path, so you can give temp or whatever. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy it into the root directory itself so that it can run directly from there. Okay, I'm just adding it. The next one would be exposing this particular rest what do you call this particular container on a port. So for example, if you run our Spring Boot application, it will be running on some port, right? So we need to expose that port. So for a simplicity, I'm going to say that I'm going to use 8085 port. Okay, so what we have done here is we have enabled OpenJDK image for our application with Java version 8, and we have added this jar version, basically the jar which we need to deploy into the Docker container from the target directory. So if you see here, we have the jar built in the target directory, and that jar we are going to add it into the Docker container in the root directory itself. Okay, and finally we are exposing our application in the port 8085. Okay, that is what we are going to do. Then finally we need to uh, tell the command with which Docker container needs to run our jar application, right? So Docker will not have that intelligence. So I'm going to say entry point. So entry point is basically like a main, right? So you are going to give the entry point, and I'm going to pass some arguments on how to run the entry point. So I'm just saying java-jar, and then I'm giving the jar name. So this is how we run, right? We run java-jar and then the jar name. So that is what I have done here in the entry point. In the entry point, I'm just giving what are all the arguments which we need to give for the Java command. Okay, so basically we are done with the Docker file. Also we have created our jar as well. So let's go to the terminal, basically the command prompt. So I'll just say let's check if Docker is installed. Okay, so I'm just saying docker -v. So this is the current version of Docker which is there in my machine, and also as I showed you guys here, right, Docker is already running. Okay, and if I go to about Docker, it is showing what version it is running. Okay, so I have basically a Docker engine running in my laptop now. So we are going to use this Docker to to deploy our jar into an image. Okay, and we are going to start that image. So in order to create an image first, what we need to do is we need to build our image. Okay, so in order to build that image, we need to get, so currently if you see where I'm in the current directory of the project where I downloaded. Okay, because this is the project, so that is where we are directly. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to build an image. So I'm going to say docker build. Okay, and I'm going to give the file. Okay, which is the file? Docker file is the file for me. Okay, and I'm going to say what is that I need to build. Okay, and I'm going to give a tag name. So I'm just going to build this docker file based on this docker file, whatever -f. Okay, based on this I'm going to give these guys a name. Okay, I'm going to give this image a name. So docker, what it does is it builds the jar and package stuff, and then it creates something called an image. So that image can be applied on any machine. Okay, that is the basically a portable, what do you call, a jar or a tar, whatever it is. So for example, if it is a Java application, we create a jar, right? So same way for a Docker application, you create an image. So that is what we are going to do here. So and I'm going to give a name for it. So I'm going to say Docker Spring Boot. Okay, if you notice here, why did it fail? Okay, so I need to also mention that where are these Docker files present. So I need to give the directory. So I'm in the current directory, right? So I just need to give a dot. So once I give that, if you notice here, what it is going to do is it is going to go and check the Docker file and do the operations which we have mentioned here. So initially I have set from OpenJDK. So it downloads the OpenJDK from the Docker Hub. So actually previously I ran this OpenJDK, so that is why it didn't download again. But if you are using it for the first time, it takes a while. It took a while for me as well. It took like 10 minutes or something. So it downloads the OpenJDK image, and then it is having the image in the current machine locally. Okay, and then finally it adds the jar which we generated into the container, okay, under the root itself, and finally it's going to expose a 8085 port. And also it is adding a entry point, basically the main command which we need to run when the image is up, or when the image is run. So now how to check if the image has got created, right? So what we need to do is we need to say docker images. So once I say docker images, if you notice here, it is going to show me all the images which are there inside my docker container locally. If you notice here, this is the image which we created is a docker spring boot, and it is showing when it got created. So 50 seconds ago we created, sometime back I created lots of images, and I was just trying it out. Okay, so if you notice here, our images got created. So now what do we need to do is we need to run this particular image, right? So we need to use the command docker run. Okay, and we need to say we are going to push the application. So I'm going to push the application onto the port 8085, and inside the container I have the port 8085, correct, right? So I'm going to expose the port 8085 for the container, and same way in the machine I'm going to map the 8085 port to the container's 8085 port. So that is what I'm saying here. So I'm going to publish the application onto 8085 port corresponding to the 8085 port of the application which is running inside the container. Okay, and finally I'm going to give the image name. So image name is nothing but docker hyphen spring hyphen boot. That's it. So this is how you run a docker image. So basically what I have done is I am just saying docker run hyphen p, the port number and the image name. So if you notice here, the spring boot logo has come up. So the spring boot application is literally coming up. So this is what is happening here is it has created a container, okay, for us. So that is what is happening. If you notice here, it has created the container and the spring boot application is up. So let's go to the browser. Okay, and let's go to the port number 8085. Okay, if you notice here, I think the application started at 8080. Okay, but we didn't map it as 8080, right? Because our we are using Spring Boot, right? So I should have added the application to start at, okay, let me do that. I'll just add it here because because this is a, since it is a Spring Boot application, right? So we had an embedded Tomcat, and if you notice here, it started at 8080 port number, but we wanted to start at 8085, right? So I'll add that. Let me rebuild this. So I'll show you how to push the application. So now what I'm doing is I deployed some version. It is not working. Now I need to rebuild the application. So what I'm doing is I'm rebuilding the application now. Okay, once it is rebuilt, I need to rebuild the image. So once the jar is rebuilt, I need to rebuild the image. So basically I need to run the same command which I did with Docker. So I need to say docker build and give the version numbers and stuff. Basically, so how to stop the Docker container is I need to say control C. Once I say control C, it will shut down the Docker image. Okay, so basically the container will get closed. So what I need to do is I need to do docker build. Okay, I need to give the path of the Docker file, and then finally I need to give the tag name. Okay, I'm going to say docker spring boot, and I'm going to give the directory in which these are there. So okay, I'm in the current directory, so I have just created a build. So this is going to create an image for us, okay, with a new jar. Okay, whatever we built. So I think it should be done by now. Step 4 are done. Okay, so it is done. Let's go and check once if the image has got built. So I'm going to say docker images. If you notice here, the our image got created 8 seconds ago, right? So now what we need to do is we need to push the application, right? So we need to run basically. So we need to run the Docker container, and I'm just saying docker run -p. I'm going to say 8085 colon 8085, and I'm giving the Docker image, Docker Spring Boot. Okay, this should run our Docker image with the 8084 port, which it already did, but our Spring Boot application was using a different port number, so our port redirection was not happening. So now I have made Spring Boot to use 8085 port. If you notice here, Spring Boot has come on the 8085 port. So let's go to the browser and see if Spring Boot is really come up. If you notice here, Spring Boot has come up. I can see the error page. So what did we create, right? What is the response which we created? Okay, we created rest docker hello. So I'm going to type that here, rest docker hello. So if you notice here, this has brought the hello YouTube, whatever we wrote, right? So that's what we wrote here, right? So if you modify, if you need to modify the application, as I showed you, right, you just go to the application, modify it, you rebuild it, and rebuild the Docker image and repush that image. Basically you rerun that image. Okay, that is how you redeploy a jar. Okay, so this is how you deploy any jar application into the Docker container. So this is similar to how you do for every type of application. If you see here, I just showed you for a Java application. If it is, let's say, a Python application or a PHP application, right, you just need to give a different image, and instead of adding a jar, it might be a different type of file which we need to push for each type of language. So if it is Python, you will give the Python scripts. If it is PHP, you will give the path of the PHP script, and you will just give that to the HTTP redirection of the Tomcat. So Apache basically. So in our case, we are using OpenJDK for Java. If it was PHP, we would have used Apache server or something like that. If you want to deploy it into Tomcat, you can directly say Tomcat. If we had a var, right, we could have used Tomcat directly. So we could have used Tomcat image, and then we could have directly used our var to deploy there. Since it is a jar application, a Java application, we did use OpenJDK in our case. And since it was a Spring Boot application, it already had the embedded Tomcat. That is why we were able to expose a port and all those things. And we were able to give a entry point. So this is how you control the Docker container, and Dockerfile is the one which is going to control your deployment, or basically the image creation, right? So if I go to the command prompt, right, if I, let me show you, I don't know if it shows the history. Yeah, if you notice here, what we did is we built a Docker image, right? We built a Docker image using docker build f Docker file, okay, and we gave a tag. So basically, tag is nothing but a name which you are giving for the image which needs to be built. Okay, that is what Docker did. So Docker built an image with this particular name. Okay, and once you say Docker images, it showed all the images which are there. and in order to run the Docker image, you need to say docker run -p, what port redirection you have to give, and then finally the image name. So if you want to run any image which is already there in the Docker hub, you can download that and you can do that as well. But in our case, we created a application locally and we created an image locally. That is why we ran that particular image locally. Okay, so I'll just summarize once again. So what I did was I went to the Docker website. I downloaded the Docker software. Okay, that basically is nothing but a Docker engine. So that is what is required for running in any machine. So that over that Docker will create containers and deploy our application inside containers using the Docker images. So what we need to do is, anytime you create an application, you need to create something called a Docker image, and in order to do the Docker image, you need to create a Docker file. So using the Docker file, you need to build the Docker image. Along with that, inside the Docker file, you mention what type of application it is and what type of files you want to deploy inside the Docker image. And using that, Docker creates images, and using that image name, we run that particular image, saying docker run. We give some port redirection. If it is required, we give it. If it is not, it's not required. And then we give the image name, and that is how you run a Docker image. So internally, if you see, Docker creates a partition, it creates a container, and it is running our application inside that container. So this is how Docker runs, and this is how the Docker engine works. That's it for this particular video. If you like the video, go ahead and like. If you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and subscribe my channel to get further updates on how to deploy applications to Docker. So in my next video, we will be seeing how to deploy a complex application into Docker. Okay, until then, see you guys. Thank you.